Now we've looked at the Battle of Lake Erie from two completely different perspectives, and you can clearly see that there are two sides to every story. Independently, each one of these stories can stand on their own, but you put those two stories together and they complement each other, and you're given a much better view of the actual battle. But just like there's two sides to every story, there are also two sides to every battle. Robert Barclay's actions in this battle were every bit as important as Oliver Hazard Perry and Jesse Duncan Elliott's. We could never expect to get a true historical account of the Battle of Lake Erie without looking at his story. Now, Robert Heroit Barclay was the son of a Scottish Prime Minister. Where Perry joined the Navy when he was 13 years old, Barclay joined the Navy when he was 11 years old. In his teens, he was a midshipman posted to Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson on his ship, the Victory. He'd fought at Trafalgar on the HMS Swiftsure, and he saved a large number of French sailors from the gale that came up after the storm. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, he was serving aboard the HMS Diana. Barclay was in command of a boarding party. They lashed the two ships together. He was in command of a boarding party with the French convoy. They had lashed the two ships together, and he was climbing over the railing. Once he got over the railing, one of their smaller caliber deck guns blew his left arm completely off of his body. But even with one arm, now that would have ended the career of a lesser officer, but even with one arm, he had more knowledge and more courage than any officer of equal rank with two arms. Besides, his mentor, the guy who trained him, Horatio Nelson, was missing his left arm as well. So Robert Heroit Barclay figured he was sitting in good company. Now, he had proposed to his childhood sweetheart, a beautiful young lady named Agnes Cossel, but he's postponed their wedding because he didn't think he was ready yet. He didn't think that he was the kind of officer, the kind of gentleman, the kind of man that would be worthy of such a beautiful young lady. So he postponed their wedding. Now in 1810, Barclay was posted to North America, where he served as a lieutenant on various ships. But despite his skills and his knowledge, many of his fellow officers considered him only handicapped and just fodder for war. In April of 1813, he was appointed a full naval lieutenant and given command of the Northern Great Lakes. But by June, he had already been outranked by a Captain James Lucas Yo, who ignored both his seniority and all of his knowledge, and assigned him command of the Canadian Provincial Marine Squadron based in Amherstburg on the northwestern edge of Lake Erie. Now, Lake Erie, as I said before, was considered expendable by the British Higher Command. And the only reason that they actually needed anyone over there at all was for their Shawnee Indian allies under Tecumseh. When Indians went to war, they didn't just send their men. Granted, the men did the bulk of their fighting, but they also sent the whole tribe along. There was 14,000 Shawnee men, women, and children encamped around Amherstburg and Fort Malden. When he got there in June of 1813, just 3 months before the actual battle, there was already no food there. The basic supplies were down to just a couple months' worth. And he immediately sent a message pleading for more basic provisions, flour, and other foodstuffs. But none of those ever arrived. In the shipyard, they were building a 300-ton brig named the Detroit. Now that was all fine and good, except they didn't have any sails for it, and they didn't have any guns for it. And most importantly, he didn't have any guys to man it. Any supplies or men headed his way had to come either overland or via Lake Ontario. But with Jesse Duncan Elliott's crew scouring Lake Ontario for British supplies, few British supply ships ever made it through. And thanks to Yao, none of those supplies ever made it to the other side of Lake Erie. Yao hoarded them all. But with this food situation, and the powder situation, and the Indian situation, his greatest problem was his manpower situation. Barclay had barely enough men to man 2 ships, let alone 6 of them. And he only had enough trained officers to properly operate 1. Of the 200-ish men that he did have, only 50 of them had ever been on a ship. And of that 50, less than 20 of them had any officer or sailing skills. So in the months leading up to the battle, he pleaded with the British command for more men, especially seamen. See, the Indians had no desire to do the big canoe thing, and the local militias had absolutely no sailing skills. So as their supplies kept dwindling, more and more of the militia would begin deserting and heading back to home. Perplexed, he asked a general friend of his what he should do, who replied that the ordnance and naval stores that you require must be taken from the enemy, whose resources upon Lake Erie must become yours. Well, he blockaded Presque Isle, and he begged Yao to coordinate with the British Army and attack the shipworks in Presque Isle. Well, the British, the Niagara and the Lawrence were still stuck inside Presque Isle. But Yao continued to ignore all these pleas. Barclay blockaded the harbor for as long as he could, but when he ran out of rations, he was forced back to Amherstburg to resupply. Now, thanks to Perry's incredible luck and Elliott's unquestionable skills, they would bring the total American fleet against him up to 9 sails. With that contingent on the lake, Fort Amherstburg and Detroit and the western Great Lakes were essentially blockaded. No fresh men were coming to Barclay, and no supplies were coming. Well, he had been left with no choice. If he didn't open a channel for supplies, the people underneath his wing were going to begin starving to death. Once the Niagara and Lawrence were on the lake, his primary concern had to be getting that 300-ton brig, the Detroit, ready. So he had to take sails from the Queen Charlotte, which made the Queen Charlotte slower, and to arm her, he had to use the 19 land-based guns that he had to take from Fort Amherstburg, from Fort Mullen. Now, these guns were 4 different calibers of long-range guns that he didn't have any fuses for. So to fire them, they would have to fire a pistol at the touch hole of each gun to set them off. Each gun was mounted differently, and he could not afford the power to train his inexperienced crew to fire them. He dispersed his officers, few as he had, throughout his fleet. And he tried to drill his men, such as they were, as much as he could, but the bulk of their training on the guns was essentially watching someone else do it, and then going through the motions on their own gun without doing the big bang part. Once the American fleet converged around Put in Bay, he was rendered unable to train his scratch crews of farmers, musicians, cobblers, and soldiers to sail anymore. He had what he had. Now, the Indians' families were beginning to starve and threatening the war. Some of the Indians had resorted to slaughtering milk cows and killing dogs to feed their families. By September of 1813, Amherstburg was so short of supplies that Barclay's sailors had already been on half rations, and he had to hide the last of the spirits for a day that he knew was not too far away. By September 10th, the garrison had only enough provisions to last 1 more day. If Barclay didn't get control of the lake, they were going to start dying of starvation anyway. So he dispersed the last of his spirits to his men. The wind was easy and slightly with him as he spotted the American fleet. Barclay lay in close collar, with the Chippewa ahead, followed by the Detroit, the Hunter, the Queen Charlotte, and the Lady Prevost, and the Little Belle. And I can just see Barclay standing there on the deck of the Detroit with his one good arm clutching the rigging of his ship as 9 American sail, fully armed, bore down upon him. A few of his musically gifted seamen struck up the song Rule Britannia to calm their hearts a little, which wafted across the Lake Erie. And at noon, at September 10th of 1813, the light and contrary winds of war shifted to the American advantage. Perry's ship got full billows and took off, way faster than all of his other ships. While Barclay ordered his longest gun to fire a ranging shot from half a mile, which fell short by just a few yards. The second shot, however, tore through the Lawrence's rigging, but she continued coming straight at him. Barclay had to use these long guns for all they were worth, and he ordered all on board to fire at will. Now remember, all of the guns on the Detroit had to be fired by firing a pistol at the touch hole, where the men on the Lawrence could just light the fuse, turn around, and cover their ears. The men on the Detroit had to load a pistol, hold their other, try to plug their ear with their shoulder, shoot it down into the touch hole, into a great big gun that was much too big for the space that they knew once it fired was going to go that way. The fact that they hit the Lawrence at all is absolutely amazing, let alone hitting it 4 or 5 times before she drew aside her. Perry lets loose his first broadside, which thunders into the Detroit with such force that it lifts the entire ship and hurls her crew against the decks and bulkheads. After the first broadside from the Lawrence, the Detroit's rudder was completely destroyed, leaving her crippled. Now every gun still on her blocks is fired again, which silences over half of the carronades on the Lawrence against her. The Lawrence fires her second broadside, which blasts through the bulwarks, the rails, and the mast. The splinters of wooden debris become shards of death as a great big chunk of this shrapnel rips off a major chunk of Barclay's thigh. Writhing in pain, he is held below as the battle continues to rage above. The Hunter and the Queen Charlotte come to the aid of their flagship as the Niagara and Caledonia continually fire at their adversaries with their incessant long-range fire. The Queen Charlotte passes the Hunter and starts firing upon the Lawrence with her carronades, with each such blast quieting the Lawrence more and more until all of the Lawrence's guns are silent. As the battle begins to soften, Barclay is returned back to the deck of the Detroit with his legs splinted, bandaged, and still bleeding, and watches Perry go over the side to the awaiting rowboat as he rows off. Barclay orders them to fire, try to hit him, but they can't. Well, Perry gets over there, and basically all the guns go silent. The Lawrence finally strikes her color. Was the battle over? Had he actually won? Were all the other ships afraid to face him? Other than random fire from the Caledonia, the rest of the American fleet lay silent. Some of his crews began to cheer and start to play until poof, the winds of war again go to the American advantage. Barclay sees the Niagara coming and orders the Detroit and Charlotte to come about to present their fresher sides to their rapidly closing enemy. But the Detroit was so badly damaged by the successive broadside attacks of the Lawrence and the Queen Charlotte, and the Queen Charlotte's officer had almost been completely eradicated by all of the Kentucky sharpshooters. His ability to maneuver his ships was gone, and the two ships plowed into each other, desperately entangling the rigging with the other. The men hacked at the ropes with hatchets and axes, and the Niagara bounded the waves with her strong and proper breeze. Perry breached the British line and lets loose his dual broadsides, which raked the Detroit and Queen Charlotte from stem to stern. Elliott brings all the smaller gunships up into the battle, and 4 of Barclay's ships are now caught in a terrible crossfire. As these smaller ships reap their havoc on the British fleet, Barclay's right shoulder blade was absolutely shattered by a load of grape shot. By this time, all of his powder was spent. Most of his officers were dead, and Barclay felt himself to be mortally wounded. His right leg was useless. His right arm was just basically hanging there. He orders his colors struck and instructs a trusted officer to tender his sword, for he had no arms left to offer. After the Battle of Lake Erie, Perry's surgeon felt that Barclay's wounds were so bad that he was absolutely positive he was going to die. And after such a gallant and courageous effort, Perry arranges a swift parole for his most respected adversary. Once paroled, Barclay soon faced a court-martial for the loss of the entire British fleet. As he was escorted into the courtroom, basically carried into the courtroom, his obviously mutilated body brought tears to the men who served with him and the men who would stand in his judgment. As the evidence was all laid out, it clearly exonerated him. On the contrary, in his loss of the Battle of Lake Erie, he was found to have been more honorable, more courageous, and more valiant than any naval commander who had ever won one. He was acquitted of any wrongdoing, but he became so deeply depressed by his appearance that he offered his fiancée a release from their engagement. But she responded that if there was merely enough of him to hold his soul, then she would marry him. And she did. And the two of them eventually raised 8 fine children. Years later, he was invited back to Quebec for a special dinner to be held in his honor. At this dinner, the inhabitants of Quebec presented Robert Barclay with a superb piece of plate on which the following inscription was engraved. Presented to Captain Robert Heroit Barclay of His Majesty's Royal Navy by the inhabitants of Quebec in the testimony that they justly entertain of the exalted courage and heroic valor displayed by him and the officers, seamen, soldiers, and marines under the flotilla under his command in an action with the greatly superior fleet of enemy upon Lake Erie on the 10th day of September of 1813. When the presence of a few additional seamen was only wanting to have effected the total discomfiture of the hostile squadron of Captain Barclay, it may most truly be said that although he could not command victory, he did more. He nobly deserved it. Thank you.